every decision you could argue is a negotiation, right? Like even if you're deciding, where to have lunch with your colleagues, like there's a negotiation embedded there, and if you're the guy who always demands on going to your place, that has a reputational dynamic. And well, how come nobody wants to have lunch with me anymore? Like, you can really start to understand that these things have big impacts.
I'm Sam Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest is Sam Yagan. I've known Sam since he was a student at Stanford Business School. He's been a very successful entrepreneur. He's exited 4 companies, including SparkNotes, including OKCupid. He was the CEO of Match.com. He's had endless negotiations. And so today, the things we cover, everything from raising capital as an entrepreneur, negotiating with employees, negotiating acquisitions, negotiating the sale of companies, personal negotiations, negotiations with boards of directors. It's a wide-ranging conversation, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. Welcome to the podcast, Sam Yagan.
Hey, Stan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been really excited for this conversation. The entrepreneurial journey is essentially one big negotiation, so you're kind of my perfect guest. You've had so many entrepreneurial chapters since we met. You started your actual journey while a student at Harvard. You started your first company there, SparkNotes, and a lot of the listeners will probably be current or former users of SparkNotes, so thank you for your contribution to society there. You had co-founders. You didn't have to seek co-founders. You and I have talked about the fact that one was your roommate and one was the kid across the hall, so you were naturally thrust together. One thing listeners who are thinking about co-founders or working with co-founders probably would love to hear from you is, how did you negotiate with them? There were inevitable differences that came up. Any negotiation stories from your co-founder days in your dorm room at Harvard University?
Sure. I think that choosing your co-founders is probably one of the 2 or 3 most important decisions you make in starting a company. And one thing that has been true throughout the partnership with this same group of people is we've always sort of been equal partners in everything we've done, despite the varying skills and talents we've brought to the table. So I just think we have a very egalitarian view and respect for each other. So I think that's that was sort of the starting point. However, one of the assumptions you make, or one of the concepts that's blended into sort of an egalitarian partnership, is that we're all going to contribute. And we ended up in a situation in SparkNotes where one of the 4 founders really wasn't pulling his weight. In fact, I would argue his greatest quality wasn't, technology or a product or business, but rather smoking pot. And it turns out that while that may be a great skill to have and have its own benefits, it doesn't have a lot of value in a startup. So we incorporated the company in March of '99, and by May we had to have a negotiation where we ended up effectively firing one of the 4 founders, and that was probably the first super high stakes negotiation I ever had in my life, and I screwed it up.
How'd it go?
Well, I think this was a case where, among the many, many lessons of negotiations I've learned is, the role that lawyers can and should and maybe shouldn't play in a negotiation. I think I probably was too deferential to our lawyers on exactly how to handle it, and hadn't done enough thinking, sort of the downstream chess game of what might come back, or what his moves might be down the road if we handled things in a certain way. And so we documented the termination and the separation, but probably hadn't covered all the bases as well as we should have. And what ended up happening down the road, we were actually on the precipice of selling the company, which was a wildly successful and great outcome for less than a year of work for a bunch of 22-year-old kids. And literally, we sent him the documents to sign. And instead of returning a signed document, what we got was an email from his lawyers, basically holding us hostage and saying that he would need $1 million to give us his signature. And so, up against the clock, where the acquirer said you need all the signatures in place by a certain date in order to close the transaction, we really had no choice but to send him $1 million. So it truly felt like a hostage situation.
I'm guessing you guys aren't in touch these days.
I haven't talked to him since January of 2000.
Yeah, no, that's a couple lessons I want to pull out there. One is the role of lawyers. In this case, it sounds like the paper just wasn't rigorous. I mean, everything wasn't covered. So you got some bad legal advice there.
Yeah, I also think that like there's what you have to do in the law, and then there's what would someone do if they were really trying to maximize their leverage over you. And so you have a principal agent problem. Like they weren't the ones that were going to be in the hot seat when this hostage situation happened. And so had I had the wisdom and experience to say, okay, how could this go wrong? Right? What could happen down the road? Then I think I would have done a bunch of things differently. And I just didn't know to ask those questions.
Yeah, we could do another whole podcast, and we should sort of be making a list of a future podcast. But the principal agent problem is obviously an important one. And the thing I would just highlight there is attorneys generally will say, we're aligned on our interests and not acknowledge the principal agent problem, but there are always differences. Absolutely. And so I think an effective lawyer will say, look, let's pick an obvious one. We bill by the hour, and that might concern you as the client that we're going to slow things down or complexify. Here's why we're not, and have that conversation rigorously as opposed to just trust them to be on the same side of the table.
I think that's right.
We ended up successfully selling that company right as you graduated from Harvard University. So congratulations on an early exit. We could talk all about that, but I want to jump to your second startup. You started a file sharing service in the video space, music space, actually way before iTunes or any of those successes. Maybe just briefly describe that company and what it did and any key negotiations you had while you were there.
After selling SparkNotes, it turns out I was unemployable. If you're a 24-year-old and your only line on your resume is CEO, you might think you're highly marketable, but it turns out nobody wants you. So I was sort of forced into a career of entrepreneurship, and through one of my good friends, met another fellow entrepreneur, and he is truly one of the most brilliant thinkers I've ever met in my life. And he, this was in the early 2000s. He had begun working on a project called eDonkey that was really a reaction to the Napster fallout that had happened in the late 90s. As you may recall, Napster was the first or the first major file sharing network, and it had been ruled illegal by virtue of having a centralized file server, and that had a catalog of all the files on the network. And my partner Jed had brilliantly come up with the idea that you could decentralize the catalog that was
right.
the central point of failure of Napster, and then have something that would sort of pass muster on that front. And so he had begun developing this technology. He had not yet commercialized it in any way, and so we met for lunch at a Cuban restaurant in Manhattan, and he showed me his technology, and I was like, I don't really understand it, but I do know how to generate, I run technology businesses and generate revenue and outcomes off of our large user base. And so we became business partners in summer of 2002 on eDonkey. What was interesting about eDonkey at that moment in time was there was still a lot of ambiguity around the legalities of file sharing. Users were using our technology in a bunch of different ways, a bunch of really wonderful legal and positive ways, but also in certain cases there was copyrighted content on the network. And so this was a time when the music companies, the record labels, and the movie companies were very litigious, not just suing operators like ourselves, but actually suing individual end customers, which was a very interesting strategy to pursue. And of all the file sharing networks, and LimeWire, Kazaa, BearShare, Grokster, these names will probably ring some bells for people. Almost all of them were incorporated offshore. They were run by people who hid in the basement. They did not want they were, many of them were the underbelly of the internet. And what was interesting about our case, where we were run by sort of professional entrepreneurs who very much wanted to do whatever we could to play by the rules and to build a durable, profitable business. And so while almost all other file sharing CEOs declined opportunities to negotiate and meet with the record labels, I made it known directly and through the press and through founding a lobbying organization that I was available anytime to go meet with folks. And so I ended up as a 24, 25-year-old I ended up meeting with very senior people, including CEOs of the record labels, trying to negotiate a sort of compromise between, what kind of content would they allow to be on the networks that the users could get access to.
The record labels famously have big personalities and difficult people. Any stories from those negotiations that would be interesting from a negotiation perspective?
Well, I think, it seemed clear to me very early on, just by the proposals they were making, that their interest was in minimizing the success of these protocols and applications and not maximizing their success. And I think once you're in a situation where your counterparty is not interested in your success, you have a fundamental misalignment. And I kind of saw the writing on the wall a little bit pretty early that this was going to be a tough to find a middle ground. And that was also mirrored in the tone that they took, in the language and the approach. And I'm not someone who yells very much, but I've been yelled at by these CEOs. In fact, the CEO of one of the 4 big labels at the end of a call said to me, "I'll see you in hell," which I guess was self-damning on his part, which I
he already knows he's going to be there.
I guess he knew he was going to be there. And so I kind of chuckled, and I didn't bother to point that out to him. I figured maybe he already knew, but that was the challenge. And then there was a further negotiation where I had been invited to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Side note to your listeners, if you get invited to testify, it turns out that's really an RSVP you can't decline because they have subpoena powers. So I asked my lawyers, I said, "Can I just send a polite no thank you?" And apparently that's not appropriate. So I did show up, and I had planned a quite thoughtful, in my opinion, and rigorous defense of our business. And I learned that these testimonies get negotiated ahead of time. And so we got a note from the lawyers of the record industry inquiring as to, "Hey, what is Sam going to testify to?" And we had sort of signaled that we were going to make a sort of affirmative case for our existence. And they came back and said, "Well, we don't want him to do that. We want him to basically throw in the towel and just sort of mea culpa." We of course were like, "Well, why would we do that?" And then
and who's
they
the
came
they
back.
there? Who are you negotiating with specifically?
It's the lobbying groups that are supporting the record industry and the Motion Picture Association, and they came back and they said, "Well, we could make sure Sam gets some very difficult questions. We could plant some very difficult questions with the senators if Sam doesn't testify the way we want him to."
So from a negotiation perspective, a threat.
100% a threat. And it was interesting because it was a threat I didn't even know was possible. I was so naive as to how these testimonies go down. And so we ended up basically, and the question they specifically said they said, "Hey, we could have Senator Feinstein ask Sam how he goes to sleep at night knowing there's child porn on the eDonkey network." To which I was going to say, "Senator Feinstein, how do you go to sleep at night knowing there's child porn in California?" But I also learned you're not allowed to ask the senators questions. This whole system is not is not quite what I had expected.
It's a charade.
So, that's right. And so that was actually interesting because I actually don't mind the intellectual back and forth on content being on the network and how do we handle that. But you think about reputation, and you think about, do you want the Google for Sam Yagan to be like, "Is child porn on your network?" And I was like, well, maybe reputationally, that's not how I want to be affiliated and associated down the road. So, it ultimately just became clear that this testimony was not going to be the right forum for us to make our case. And so we ended up with a very anodyne testimony, and it just kind of, no one ever cared.
It's so interesting. I did not know that testifying before Congress was such a negotiation in of itself. That's so interesting. Well, just to kind of put a bookend on this, the record labels sounds like they weren't amenable. They're behaving badly. My guess is that, that ultimately led to iTunes, because you can only hold that dam back for so long. Any insights quickly on that? And we don't need to dwell on it, but I'm kind of curious as to your perspective.
Yeah, you could do a podcast on the history of music. I think when there are these big transformational changes, and this isn't just in music, I think this is sort of everywhere you look, there's often some precedent event that has changed the leverage or the thinking the sort of common knowledge or the default thinking in the industry. And I think in this case, back in the 90s, record labels made money selling plastic discs with 18 songs on it for $18, even though you only wanted the one song, right? And so they were loath to break up the album in favor of the single. And so I think if Steve Jobs shows up and says, hey, I've got a great idea, 99-cent singles instead of $18 CDs, I think despite his lore and deity status, I think, he gets thrown out of the office just like I did. However, in the early aughts, you had tens of millions of people downloading singles, right? People weren't downloading albums, they were downloading the songs that they wanted. And, I think what the file sharing applications did, not just ours, really Napster first, was they sort of separated the single from the album and made that the ubiquitous form. And so when that set the table for Steve Jobs to sort of descend from the heavens with this great idea of, hey, instead of people stealing your singles, because now the alternative was people are stealing your singles, how about getting 99 cents per single? Now all of a sudden that's way better than zero, worse than $18. But that, that setup really changed everything. And so I would argue, but for the file sharing, again, not eDonkey in particular, but for file sharing having really reset the relationship between consumers and music, I don't know that iTunes ever exists.
Interesting. Well, famously, one of Steve Jobs' parents is a Syrian immigrant. And so the music industry had no idea that the children of Syrian immigrants were going to disrupt their business model and change music forever. So
much to their chagrin, perhaps. Yeah. Well, and again, I guess now, never before has music been consumed as much. And, there's more revenue in music than ever before. So I think, this is one of those things where in general, technology does expand the pie and you have to, but it changes the way you do business and it changes who gets what part of the pie. And I think that's what scares people.
So in your entrepreneurial journey, you're still a fairly young guy at this point. How old are you?
28.
28 years old. You've had a lot of negotiations. It's really on-the-job training. What would you recommend to entrepreneurs to sort of short circuit their training in negotiation? What advice would you give around that?
The thing about negotiating, and obviously I've taken negotiating classes in business school and whatnot. I think there's really no substitute. The on-the-job training, you got to be in it. You got to play the game. I think to really have the learnings seared into your brain and into your gut. And so I really encourage entrepreneurs or anybody to be involved in as many negotiations as possible. And whether it's sitting on boards, whether it's offering yourself up to brainstorm with other founders or other entrepreneurs going through tricky things, or just listen to as many negotiation, real war stories as possible. Because I think a lot of this is just starting to understand the kinds of moves that are available and the kinds of dynamics that often present themselves, whether it's principal agent problems or the like that we've already talked about here. For example, I have this thing where whatever a document says is not really binding necessarily because it's going to get renegotiated, but it sets the leverage and the dynamics for that subsequent negotiation. So it makes you think about, well, what concept should I put in this agreement today that I'm going to want to leverage and trade off down the road? And that's the kind of thing that someone can tell you in business school and you can kind of write it down on a test and get it right. But until you've seen it play out and you're like, oh, I'm so glad we set this up this way because it let me trade it off down the road. I think until you've done it a few times, it's just very hard to remember all the things, sort of all the tricks in the playbook.
I got an email last night from one of my former Stanford students who said, hey, I'm in this highly analytic job. I'm doing spreadsheets most of the day. How can I learn better to negotiate? And a consistent piece of advice that I've given to students is that those highly analytic jobs, if you go to work at McKinsey, you go to work at Goldman Sachs, you go to work at a hedge fund, you're in spreadsheets all day. And I don't think those are great places to learn to negotiate. And so what I encourage students to do is as much people-oriented employment as possible. So sales, operations, marketing, you learn so much more about negotiation than you can, sitting in front of a terminal. So it's how much contact do you have with people in your job is going to correlate to your negotiation lessons.
Yeah. I mean, almost, every decision you could argue is a negotiation, right? Even if you're deciding, where to have lunch with your colleagues, there's a negotiation embedded there. And if you're the guy who always demands on going to your place, that has a reputational dynamic. And well, how come nobody wants to have lunch with me anymore? You can really start to understand that these things have big impacts. So yeah, I totally agree. You just want to be in as many interactions as possible.
Yeah, I tell people, look, negotiation is an essential language to get stuff done. Right. Most people aren't very good at it. And so if you can get some skill through training, I'm surprised that you didn't mention is the way to learn is to listen to the All Things Negotiation podcast.
Number one.
Number one and number two and number three. But it's really the people stuff. Let's jump forward to OKCupid. Lots of our listeners maybe have been users of OKCupid. Some of them might have met their mate through OKCupid. So we haven't talked about fundraising. You guys had a decision, and I think you worked with some of the same founders as SparkNotes.
Correct.
You had to decide whether to raise capital. Any stories around early capital raising negotiations for OKCupid?
Yeah, I'm a big believer. I said earlier, one of the most important decisions you make is who you start a company with. I think one of the other top 3 or 4 things is who you raise capital from, because these are going to be your long-term partners and the people who you're going to go through, sometimes a decade-long journey with. We were raising our Series A, which is the first sort of institutional round of capital that a startup usually raises. And I had just graduated from Stanford Business School, and I was, all excited to put my, credentials and fancy degrees to work. And I had gone all up and down Sand Hill Road, which is where all the venture capital offices used to be, and many still are. Fundraising, and we were trying to raise something like $6 million to fund OKCupid, and most of the VCs laughed me out of their room. They said, online dating is for losers, which I think was a very myopic thing to say for tech investors. But that's another podcast. And we did end up with several firms that were interested, and there was one in particular, and it's a really interesting story because it shows how persuasion attempts can actually backfire. So typically when a venture capital firm makes issues a term sheet, an intent to invest, there are other VCs who are also trying to invest. And so you're really trying to put your best foot forward to convince the founder to take your capital. And so we had gotten this offer from a blue chip firm, a firm everyone, would have heard of. And the 2 of the partners took us out to dinner and was, wining and dining us. And then at the end, we were just sort of wrapping up and we were all heading back to the airport to get on our red eye back to New York. And the founder looked me in the eye, shook my hand, looked me in the eye and said, Sam, I really think OKCupid is how I'm going to make my name in the Valley. And what he was trying to say was, I believe in you. I'm going to work hard for you. I've reserved more capital to invest in you. You're going to be very successful. What I heard was, oh my God, I have another stakeholder whose ego and ambition I have to worry about. And we took the red eye back, and I couldn't sleep. Just the whole time I'm just sitting there thinking, oh my God, I don't know if we're going to be that. I knew we would be successful, or I thought we would, but I was like, I don't know if we're going to be so successful as to, make this guy's career. And then I felt guilty. I was like, well, what if I don't make this guy's career? And then I was just like, what am I doing? Like, why am I like, I should be thinking about my company. And instead I'm thinking about this guy's like, whether he's going to make the Midas list because he invested in OKCupid. And so we landed in New York, and I immediately knew, having spoken to my partners, I was like, we can't take this guy's money. I don't want this burden. It felt like a burden, and not a liberating opportunity, which is what capital should feel like.
2 lessons I want to highlight there. This is a really good story. One is that the intent, and he may have had very positive intent there,
no doubt,
but the impact on you was different than his intent. And for most of us, much of the time, there's an intent impact gap. And so recognize that not just what you say, but what they hear is really going to drive a negotiation. So that's the first lesson I'd like to highlight. The second is alignment of interests. Often students will come to me, Stanford students, and say, hey, I've got a term sheet from the best venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. And I'll say, well, tell me why it's important to have those guys. Who's the individual partner? What are their interests? What are their intentions? And it turns out that if you raise a Series A from, one of 10 of the most prominent venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, they're not going to let you exit for less than $1 billion. and you might want to exit for less than $1 billion. And so that's just one example of alignment with interest. Is that your experience that alignment of interest with venture capitalists is both hard and important?
Extremely. I have been, I'm actually the chair of a board right now where there is a fundamental disagreement between the desires and goals of one of the investors with basically all of the rest of the investors and the founder. And it is the singular, it has become such a big deal that it is causing a distraction in the company. And it is it's literally the primary challenge the company has faced, I would say, in the last year, has been this misalignment of interests on the cap table and on the board. And so I just can't stress enough understanding what are the expectations you have, investor, from a returns perspective, a timeline perspective. And, when I think about OKCupid, we ended up delivering, a really, really solid return to the investors we ended up choosing. And they were thrilled with the outcome and the performance. That exact same performance, had we delivered to this partner from the Sand Hill Road firm, I think would have been disappointing. And that's just because different investors have different risk reward expectations and time horizon expectations. And so not only was it a better outcome for us, it was it was just the optimal outcome for everybody, that we got the right investors involved in the business who wanted the return we were able to deliver.
Let's get tactical on that, because this is such an important topic. If you were advising, so I'm coming to you as an entrepreneur for advice.
Yeah.
And I say, Sam, how do I figure out how to align interests with investors, and what questions should I ask the investor to see if we're aligned in terms of our interests? Give me kind of the bullet points on questions an entrepreneur should ask as they negotiate.
I think one reason entrepreneurs don't do this is because so many founders think that we have to present this view to investors that we're going for the unicorn or bust. And so to ask a question of an investor that contemplates a non-unicorn outcome is seen as weak, right? And so people don't want to have the conversation of, hey, what happens if?
And just quickly, because everyone won't be tech fluent, a unicorn is sort of $1 billion or higher exit.
Correct. And so, and just generally is sort of this concept of like a great outcome. And the reality is most outcomes are not great. They're good or bad, but great is hard. And so, for example, a conversation that I would encourage is just to have a few sort of scenarios, sort of not a role play, but hey, let's talk through a couple of, let's say 2 years go by and we get an offer to sell the company for 3 times, where you would get 3 times your money, Mr. Investor. The question to ask isn't, would you take it or not? Because they'll say, well, I don't know, it depends. The question to ask is, how would you approach that conversation with me at that time? Are you, and then they, what you're listening for is, are they going to say, look, it would be a no-brainer to say no because we haven't met our goals? Or would it be, hey, I would understand that like this would be a life-changing outcome for you. And we would have a conversation about how to make sure you took some money off the table to achieve your goals while still achieving their openness to that conversation is very important. And it does 2 things. Number 1, it gives you information. And number 2, it sort of binds them to their word. Most people don't like the cognitive dissonance that comes with being inconsistent with the previous position they've taken. Now, some people will do it and have no qualms about it. But in general, if someone has told you, in this situation, I will act this way, they're not going to act diametrically opposite. And again, it has happened, but people, I think, don't want to do that. And so to the extent you've already had the conversation, you can reference that. You can say, hey, I know when we first got together, we sort of previewed this happening. And then that sort of sets the conversation up in a way that's going to be beneficial to you. Again, even though you don't have any document that sort of obligates them to act that way, I think just human nature sort of sets it up in a way that will be in your interest. But you have to be willing to say to an investor, yeah, we might engage in a conversation about only selling the company for $100 million. And a lot of founders don't want to even, they have to present this like macho, like, well, I would never even think about that. Why would we sell the company for $100 million? And there are lots of reasons. Yeah. One of the reasons might be because you make $20 million, founder, which for most people is a lot of money.
Yeah. Let me add a couple things there. I encourage entrepreneurs to ask questions about the partnership dynamics at the venture capital fund. For example, the individual partner, has he or she had a liquidity event in the last couple of years? How important is this to their career? Where is the fund in terms of its fund life cycle? I ask for references on other companies and did they continue to fund them? And so I think entrepreneurs, for some reason, have been led to believe that the investors have the leverage in that negotiation versus the entrepreneur. And I think it's just the opposite. The bottleneck is good ideas and good entrepreneurs. Capital is, I don't want to quite say a commodity, but it's plentiful these days in terms of lots of funds. Would you agree with those?
I totally agree. I also think the question the references the entrepreneurs that I want the entrepreneurs to call is you've got to call the founders who didn't succeed.
Exactly.
Because again, it's like any relationship. If things are going great, of course, everyone's happy. That's true in a marriage. That's true on a basketball team. That's true in a business partnership. Like when things are going well, it's really, really easy to get along. The problem is, okay, when the pandemic came and your revenue was down 95% and you had to fire 30% of your people on 3 days notice, what did your investors say? Did they show up? How did they act? Did they, we have a travel company in our portfolio, and July of 2020, like most uncertain part of the pandemic, we increased our investment in this company, in a travel company, that there was no travel happening. And to this day, when he does references for us, that's all he talks about. He doesn't talk about all the like good stuff and whatever. He's like, we were on the verge of going out of business, and these guys believed. Like they did not back down. And so, you want to see how people act when it's hard to do the right thing, when it's hard to be a good person or whatever, when your interests might be misaligned with the others. How did you act? How did you exert leverage? Did you show up when, in your best way?
Yeah. Well, let's put a pin in that and add it to our list of podcasts. We could definitely do one on how to select an investor, how to negotiate with investors once you've taken their money. But I want to jump to a different topic, which is M&A. So you eventually sold OKCupid.
Correct.
How did that negotiation go? What are the lessons you can pull from that transaction? Because M&A is the thing that lots of entrepreneurs are going to encounter, and it's heavy on negotiation.
Yeah, I find corporate M&A, it's one founders I always hear founders say, well, if I get big enough, so-and-so will just buy me. And I think until you've been through the process, you don't realize what a miracle. It's like childbirth. Corporate M&A and childbirth are like miracles that once you've gone through, you're like, how does that ever happen? So it was 2010, and we had decided that we had, my partners and I had been in the business for about 7 years. The business was doing fine, not great. We were kind of a little bit in purgatory, not growing fast enough to be, on a path to being $1 billion company, but also certainly not doing poorly enough where you would want to shut down the business. And so we decided to emerge, go down this path of M&A, and so we started reaching out. And in the dating business, there's really only a handful of players. Match.com at the time was called Match.com was one, eHarmony was another. But it was a very small industry, and so it was in many ways it was easy for me to get a hold of the potential buyers and sort of get in front of them. Throughout 2010, OkCupid started becoming more of a household name. We were, we had written this blog that got very popular. We were sort of in in the New York Times. I think we made 3 different section covers on 3 consecutive Sundays or something. So we were sort of really emerging as the sort of up and coming dating business. So at some point we get a first offer of $10 million for the business. That's a lot of money in sort of the scheme of things. It's a bad outcome. If you've been working on a business for 7 years and you've raised $7.5 million, that's not, founders don't make a lot of money or really much of any money in that case. And so that was both, very positive to get an offer, but again, also not that exciting. But from my perspective, getting the offer is really the beginning of a negotiation. And until you get the offer, there's nothing to do. You're not working toward anything until you get that first offer. So we got the first offer of $10 million. We ended up getting another offer that was $18 million. And part of that negotiation involved what's called an earnout, which means a contingent payment based on our performance after the transaction. So we would get $18 million up front, and then we had the opportunity to earn another $27 million, depending on how we performed. And I won't use names, but that particular company was not the company we wanted to sell to. In fact, it was a company that we would have been very disappointed to sell to. And so I worked. Match was our desired buyer, and so I worked so hard. I probably had half a dozen meetings with the CEO of Match and the corporate development team, and I just couldn't get them to really lean in enough to make an offer. In fact, So this term sheet that we got from the $18 million company, it expired on, I believe, November 18th, if I remember correctly.
Just a note on that, Sam, in your experience, do those term sheets actually expire? People do all kinds of things to try to force your hand, whether it's employment offers that expire or term sheets that expire.
Yeah.
In my experience, they don't really expire. What about you?
In my experience, they don't really expire, although I think you have to have a good answer for why you're not saying yes, right? So you can work it, I think, but nobody likes to have their offer shopped. And so if it's evident that, well, we're just sitting on this offer because we were waiting for someone to offer more, then at some point that person gets annoyed and it's like, well, go pound sand, I'm just going to pull it. And so it's not like it's binding to the minute or to the day, but I think spiritually it's binding in that it's not going to sit there forever. But sure, if I said I need a day or something, that would have been fine. So just to show like how naive I was, even though I think I was, pretty smart guy. I had a meeting with Match that afternoon at 1:00 in their office in Manhattan. And somehow I thought that I would get them to give me a term sheet like live, which, as you know, never happens. But I was, the consummate optimist at the time. And so went into the meeting, and it was one of the worst 10 meetings of my life. Like literally, the CEO of Match spent the hour screaming at me, like at maximum volume.
This is a pattern, Sam. We've got the music companies screaming at you, the Match.com screaming at you. Maybe it's you.
With me? It's wrong. And yet I don't scream. And so literally, so the meeting is a disaster. I didn't even tell him we had a term sheet we had to sign by 5:00 because the leverage, the dynamic, it would have seemed so out of left field for me to be like, hey guys, we have an offer. So I remember I walked up the West Side Highway from 18th Street all the way up to 39th Street. And I was just like, what am I going to say? I was just beating myself up the whole time. I was like, oh, what am I going to say to my co-founders? What am I going to say to my board? We had a board meeting at 5 that was to accept the offer. I was like, man, I felt like such a failure. And, kind of I trudge into the office. And my wife was pregnant at the time. And she texts me. And she's like, hey, I'm having contractions. You have to come home. And
this is real. This isn't a tactic.
It's 100% real. And so, but my wife, of all people, would never, ever participate in any kind of shenanigans. So that would be a strategic tactic like that. Anyway, and I had a good relationship with the CEO that had made the offer, the $18 million offer. And his wife had actually had some pregnancy problems. So when I texted him and said, hey, I've got to get to Chicago, he was like, no problem, whatever, take the weekend, just do your thing. So literally I sprint to LaGuardia, get home, land at O'Hare, check my phone, and my wife is like, false alarm, no problem, all good, I'm going to sleep. So I was like, okay, good. I kind of get home, and for the first time, I sort of had the minute to just be like, okay, what happened today, and what are we going to do? And so over the course of the last 9 months, as I'd been getting to know the leadership at Match, I had gotten the CEO's cell phone number, just as one does when you're sort of coordinating a meeting or whatever. And I decided Saturday morning, I was like, I'm going to call him. Now, for your listeners who maybe haven't been involved, it is highly, highly unusual for a startup founder to call the industry leading CEO on a Saturday morning. This is not in any playbook, that's for sure. But I called him and he picked up, and I said, hey, I just wanted to let you know, we're going to sign a term sheet to sell the company on Monday morning. And he was shocked. He was like, why didn't you tell me yesterday? You were literally in my office. And I said, you were screaming at me for an hour. So it didn't seem right to tell you. And he said, are you serious? And I said, I'm calling you on a Saturday morning in November. This isn't just like how I'm spending my weekend. And he said, okay, if you're serious, I will have my team spend the weekend working, and we'll have something to you on Monday. And sure enough, and I know this now because I ended up being very good friends to this day with the woman who ran Corp Dev for him. And she's like, I woke up in Las Vegas at a girls' weekend, and there were literally 42 emails from my boss saying, we've got to work on OKCupid this weekend. And so they end up they worked the whole weekend through. We were exchanging data with them and information. And on Monday, they gave us an offer. And that offer was from our desired buyer, but also much, much better than the offer that we had gotten. And so we ended up going with Match, and that not only was economically far superior for us, as my career ended up unfolding at Match, it was, ended up being just transformative for me as a professional.
I want to highlight two lessons that you brought up. One is what made that work with Match was having a credible alternative.
Correct.
Okay. And people sometimes will ask, can you lie about an alternative? Can you make up an alternative? And in my experience, it never makes sense to lie, period, because it comes back to roost. But people can ferret that out. And he tried to do that by saying, hey, are you real about this? And you had a credible threat there. And so I think you really do need alternatives. Entrepreneurs who go down the unilateral path with one strategic buyer don't have any leverage. And so that's super important. You alluded to before, hey, people don't want to be shopped. The reality is people get shopped, right? It's in the entrepreneur's interest to shop and have alternatives. And so many strategic buyers will reach out to entrepreneurs and say, we want to buy your company. Don't talk to anybody else. That's never the right thing. You always want to be talking to multiple parties.
I totally agree. You have to have, and I think what you find is you are a more credible negotiator when you believe what you're saying.
No question.
I've seen people try to bluff me, and I'm like, you don't even believe what you're saying. And you can see through that stuff, because it's very hard to tell someone you've got to give me this offer by this date. And that when they don't, you have nothing, and when they call you the next day and say, hey, are you still open to an offer? And you say yes, you have permanently lost your leverage with the counterparty. And so I hate being in that situation. I love negotiating. I almost never bluff.
I'd add to that and take it one step further, which is not only do you lose your reputation with that counterparty for life, but they talk. And your reputation really moves quickly. And so when I was running an investment bank, a common comment I would get from buyers is, Stan, you're a tough negotiator. We know we're going to pay a premium because you're the bank, and we know that you're not going to tell us something that's not true. We've checked around. And so reputation, I just can't emphasize that enough, that it takes a lifetime to build, one bad bluff to tear away. And so never bluff, never lie. It's just simple. It's easier to remember. I want to do one micro lesson there, which is you had his cell phone. I always ask either for people's cell phone or what is the way you like to be contacted and how can I most quickly get to you? Because people are different. Some people like a text, some people like a call, some people like an email, some people like, social media. But I literally, in my networking, in my contact database, I will write down, here's how he or she likes to be contacted. And I found that to be a very effective tool in negotiation.
I agree. And I just think something beyond email is key, because email someone on a Saturday morning, it's just very hard to really communicate urgency or tone. You text someone and you say, hey, need to talk to you for 5 minutes. That's, if you have any relationship with that person's going to call you.
Yeah, exactly. All right. We're going to change and transition to a new topic that will be one of our future podcasts, because this is certainly a big one, which is you went from running, how many people were at OKCupid, 20, 30?
37, I think, at our peak.
Okay, 37 people. You work at Match.com, and that's a tough transition that we don't have time to analyze right now and to discuss. But pretty quickly, they ask you to be the CEO of Match.com. So you go from running a 37-person organization to, gosh, there've got to be over 1,000 people at that time at Match. That's got to be a different negotiation journey. So any lessons from internal negotiations and what you had to do in terms of on-the-job learning, where you failed, where you succeeded? Just talk about internal ops and negotiation at a big company.
I mean, the first thing I learned is in a startup, small company, founder led. If a founder says to do something, people do it. Even if you don't have a command and control culture, which we certainly didn't at OKCupid, it was a very open and flat. If one of the founders said do something, and again, it's not that people wouldn't push back or debate. People fundamentally said, great, we believe in what these guys are doing. We are here to follow their lead. Let's do it. I remember I remember making a decision and sort of just saying to the exec team, we're going to do this. And kind of nobody really caring I had said that and just being like, yeah, we're not, maybe we're going to do that. Maybe not. But this was even just a pretty minor thing about just how we were going to handle like an administrative policy. And it was just like, I didn't do the work of getting them bought in. And that is like, again, I think when you're leading a large, complex organization and you realize that like your execs are the amplification and are your communication mechanism to the rest of the organization, having the executives bought in and truly believing in what you want them to do can often be the difference between your idea being implemented and executed well, or just kind of like, in one ear out the other. And I didn't realize the work I had to do to earn trust, respect, credibility, and buy-in from the executives. Because again, in my old world, someone who chooses to work at a founder-led startup is sort of already drinking the Kool-Aid, right? Whereas someone working in a corporate job may have that job for any one of a number. They like, it's convenient to where they live. It's pays well, it's the best job they could get. Like there's a lot of reasons people work in big companies versus a startup where there's the selection bias is so strong, it makes leading it much easier.
So you got to internally negotiate. And I often tell people that the internal negotiations are often more complex than say, client, supplier. You all assume you're on the same team, but there are issues and interests that are complex. I remember a story you told me about, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a while, you really were pushing Match having a mobile app, which they did not have at that time. There was some resistance on the exec team. Is that a negotiation story that'd be worth telling?
Yeah, this is a great one. And this is the lesson I learned here is that, and this is, I think, true beyond negotiating. I think how leaders frame questions and frame conversations really drives both the negotiation, but even just the way it unfolds. So I took over Match in 2012. So this is long after, the App Store and mobile apps are a thing. And Match did not have a mobile app of consequence. And the reason they didn't was because any transaction, any payment you take through the App Store, you have to pay Apple 30%. Okay. And so there's a real business reason not to do this, which is, do you want to give Apple 30% of our revenue? Now, my general view on business and life is I try to take a long-term view and I try to say, what is the right thing to do in the long term? And so I knew that I wanted to sort of move toward a mobile app. However, sort of pursuant to the conversation we just had, anytime I would say we're going to do this, it was just met with like resistance. And basically I would say we're going to do it and then nobody would go do it because they would be like, Sam's not going to be here that long anyway. We go through CEOs pretty quickly. We'll just wait for the next guy. And so we finally had this I finally called this big meeting where we were all going to get aligned. And one by one, I saw the execs walk into the big conference table and I saw like the finance team with their spreadsheets going to argue no. And I had the analytics team was going to argue no. And everyone's going to argue no. And I just opened up the conversation and I said, hey, before we dig into the actual arguments pro and con, I just want to frame up the question. I said, in some number of years, we're going to go to the board and we're going to have one of two conversations with the board. Okay. We're either going to say, hey, board, we have good news and bad news. The good news is we have great margins. We're not giving any money to Apple. However, we've lost our our position of market leadership. Okay, that's conversation one. Conversation two is, hey, board, I have good news and bad news. Our margins are off. They're compressed from what they used to be. However, we're still number one in the market. Okay, and I said the conversation where we have great margins and market leadership is no longer a choice. Like that, I would like to be a supermodel. There's a lot of things I would like to be true in the world that just aren't true. And so what do we as a leadership team want to be able to say? Market leadership, lower margins, higher margins, lower market leadership. And everyone unanimously looked at each other and said, oh, I would absolutely rather be number one in the market with lower margins. So the meeting that was slotted for 2 hours ended up being 15 minutes. And everybody just immediately said, oh, well, when you put it that way, let's do it. And that was such a big learning for me because in the moment, everyone was thinking about we're going to miss our numbers this year. Like everyone was just saying we're just immediately going to have lower earnings this quarter as we start paying Apple. We're going to have to invest in building an app. It was all just like headwind, cost. But it was like a forest for the trees argument. But no one was looking out far enough where what are the downstream ramifications of this decision that we just made? And so once I was able to crystallize that, the end path, the end states, I describe myself sometimes as an end state thinker. Like, what are the end states of this decision that we just made? One is high margin, low share. One is low margin, high share. And then the decision was made.
So I want to highlight two things there. One is framing. You use that word. And the frame is something you have to prepare for. You have to think hard ahead of time. What are their interests and what are they going to hear? And so you hear this cliche of put yourself in their shoes, but you literally have to, and sometimes it involves research, understand what's important to them and then change their choice, right? Essentially showing them that this approach, in this case, doing what you wanted to do by doing mobile was in their own interest. And so you've got to do two steps. You've got to actually understand what they care about as opposed to just do top down. And then you've got to change their choice, essentially. It sounds like you did that really effectively.
That's right.
How about the Tinder story? That'd be worth telling. We're starting to get short on time, but I think you had some resistance when, tell me where that idea came from and where the resistance was and how you overcame it, if you could do that in a quick way.
Sure. Look, we at Match were the market leaders. We were, by far the dominant player in the category. We had incubated an app called Tinder. Everyone knows Tinder, so I won't explain what it is. But suffice it to say that it had a very different business model from Match. Match was this gated community. We charged everybody a very high subscription fee to join Match. Tinder was free. It was fun, and it was a company. It was a product that at the time we launched it had no monetization at all, and it had zero revenue and only expense, and it was meaningfully cannibalizing our core business. Meaning we could see you didn't even have to look hard in the data. It was Tinder was growing, Match was in decline.
Right.
And I got strong resistance from the most senior people in the company. I had one guy one of the most senior executives walk into my office and said, "What are you gonna do about Tinder? It's eating into my bonus." Two relatively junior people who at every all hands, this one woman at every all hands was the first question. And she was like, "When are you going to monetize Tinder? It's cannibalizing our business." Like from the most senior to mid-level, everybody was concerned. And one of the things I had done when I had first joined Match, not specifically because of knowing we were going to start Tinder, but because I believed it was the right thing to do, is I had lobbied the board to give everyone in the company equity, but when I joined, only 6 people in the company had equity, and I had pushed hard to get everyone equity. And so by the time Tinder was really a thing, everyone in the company literally was an owner. And so what they saw, and again, this is a time horizon thing, which is, I think, one of the big things that comes up in negotiating. Everybody was so concerned about the short-term impact of Tinder on the business. And the short-term impact was negative. In the same way, our mobile app, the short-term impact was negative. But what I said to everybody was, listen, you all have equity in the business. You all own part of Tinder, right? Because Tinder is one of our products. And I said, we should all be lucky that we started Tinder inside of Match and not 2 guys in a garage, where we would be freaking out if, we didn't control this asset, if somebody else did. And so it was this constant sort of reminder of people that this thing that seems scary today is actually a good thing for us in the long run, because it's going to make all of us more valuable. And, Tinder itself ended up being valued at, tens of billions of dollars down the road, much, much larger than Match ever was on its own.
Fantastic. So it's really both aligning interests, in this case through equity, understanding their concerns, validating those concerns, and still moving in the same direction, but just not in an imperial way.
And just realizing that time horizon is one of these things that's always present, but not under the surface, but not always visible. In fact, I had a negotiation with one of my colleagues here just last week where, I'm thinking about a 20-year time horizon, and she's thinking about a 2-year time horizon. And that, as we surfaced that was the primary primary salient issue in our conversation.
So Match, famously owned by IAC, Barry Diller is kind of the central sort of person there, or certainly has been and has a negotiation reputation publicly. Did you have negotiations with him? Did you learn from him? Anything we can learn from your negotiations with Barry Diller?
I never negotiated directly with Barry. He had stepped back at the time. I had the great privilege to sort of be around a lot of negotiations he led and learned a lot by osmosis, but no specific time where he, crushed me in a negotiation, which is what would have happened, of course.
All right. Well, let's just end up with some rapid fire questions. And again, these are all questions that could be open-ended long or short. And so I'm going to encourage concise answers to questions that could go on. Who's the most difficult person you've negotiated with?
Probably my wife, because she knows me the best.
Say more about that.
One of the things about negotiations is I think you want to be able to be very prepared and sort of more prepared than your counterparty with more information and just more sort of forethought. And when someone just knows you very well, it's just very hard. It's very hard to be sort of 3 moves ahead because, she's in my brain, right? And so that's probably the hardest negotiation.
Do you have any unresolved or upcoming negotiations with her?
I hope not.
Okay. Final question. Are there books, resources? So a question I get constantly is, I want to learn more about this stuff. I want to become a better negotiator.
Other than your podcast, which I now know is the right answer.
Good answer.
There's a book by this guy Cialdini called Influence, which I don't think is a negotiation book on its face, but the title is Influence. And if you just think, it's full of these like studies and anecdotes about just how to have influence, and just these little anecdotes and windows into the minds of people, and little tricks just little insights that I find myself relying on over and over, even though there aren't these like 3 frameworks for negotiating. It is just a reminder of how primable and malleable the brain is, and that just a little bit of work framing conversations, setting the table, explaining your rationale, just a few very basic things that have stuck with me in the 20 years since I read the book.
Fantastic. Robert Cialdini, who's a professor at ASU. I do see that as a negotiation book, and I use a chapter of that in my negotiation class. So I think that's a great suggestion, a good place to wrap up. So thank you so much, Sam, for spending an hour with us, and we'll be talking soon.
All right, Stan, this was fun. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review, which helps others find the show. The show was produced by Benny Beausoleil. Original music by Peter Breinhold. Designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.